the University of Ibadan. I warmly welcome you to the 413th and 14th in the series of inaugural lectures for the 2016-2017 academic session. Today's lecture, entitled Of Oracles and Ventricles, the Squeeze, the A's, and the Eels Surmounting the Odds, will be delivered by Professor Samuel Omokhodion of the Department of Pediatrics, Faculty of Clinical Sciences, College of Medicine of this university. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, may I inform you that any moment from now, the academic procession will file in. And that academic procession will file in a single procession comprising directors of academic institutes and centers, deans of faculties, and of the postgraduate school and of students, with the Provost of College of Medicine, the inaugural lecturer, and the Vice Chancellor at the rear. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Professor Omokhodion has brought fame and recognition to this university through his profound scholarship in the circles of pediatricians. At the end of this lecture, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the academic procession will lead the hall in a reverse order, meaning the inaugural lecture will lead the procession. May I also inform you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that when the academic procession files in, you are please expected to rise and remain standing until the academic procession takes its seat. Also, you are please expected to rise and remain standing when either we sing the national anthem and the university anthem. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in this university, inaugural lectures are very significant to our reputation and our day-to-day excellent academic activities, and as such, we will appreciate it very much if you will assist us in observing a solemn atmosphere throughout this lecture. May I inform you, ladies and gentlemen, that we are streaming this program live on www.ui.edu.ng. May I also inform you that we are also broadcasting this lecture live on our UI Diamond FM, known as 101.1 FM, where we are promoting values and excellence. It is also pertinent to inform you that we have some emergency exits at all the sides of this hall, where you have all these wine curtains. Please, if you move clearer to them, they are exit doors in case of emergency. And if it is also you are feeling funny or feeling falling, please draw the attention of any of our ushers to yourself, who will in turn quickly address and draw the attention of our medical personnel to wherever you may be. And at the end of this lecture, you may not take the only main entrance there. You may take all these emergency doors for you to leave this arena. The Vice Chancellor, Professor Ibeli Duwola Yenkan FAS, deeply appreciates your attendance at this lecture. My name is Olatunji Oladejo, Director, Directorate of Public Communication, Office of the Vice Chancellor, University of Ibadan. You are most welcome. The academic procession will file in, and the academic procession is in one single division, comprising directors of academic institutes and centers, deans of faculties of the postgraduate school, and of students, with the Provost College of Medicine, Vice Chancellor, and the inaugural lecturer at the rear. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, may we rise for the academic procession.
Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic, the Registrar, University Librarian, Provost of the College of Medicine, Dean Faculty of Clinical Sciences, Deans of other faculties, the postgraduate school and of students, Directors of institutes and centers, heads of departments, distinguished girls, ladies and gentlemen. The 413th University of Ibadan inaugural lecture will be delivered by Professor Samuel Ilenre Omokhodion of the Department of Pediatrics on behalf of the Faculty of Clinical Sciences. Born on March 9, 1953, to Pa Jacob Abulime and Madam Victoria Idewede Omokhodion of Umuhi Epoma, Eastern West Local Government Area of Edo State, Professor Samuel Ilenre Omokhodion attended Alafia Institute Mokola here in Ibadan between 1959 and 1964, and Edo College, Benin City, between 1965 and 1969. He was offered admission to the pre-degree program in medicine of this university in 1971 and graduated MBBS in 1977. He had his internship rotations at the University College Hospital, Ibadan, from July 1977 to June 1978, after which he participated in the National Youth Service Corps scheme as a medical officer at the General Hospital, Panshin in Plateau State, from July 1978 to July 1979. Between August 1979 and May 1987, he was variously Senior House Officer, Registrar, and Senior Registrar in Pediatrics at the University College Hospital, Ibadan. He was awarded the Fellowship of the National Postgraduate Medical College in 1986. During this service 1 year abroad training period, he obtained the Certificate of Pediatric Cardiology of the University of Amsterdam, Academic Medical Center in Amsterdam, also in 1986. He obtained the Fellowship of the West African College of Physicians in 1992. He had a 2-year fellowship at the Department of Cardiology of the Adassa University Hospital, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, between 1996 and 1998, where he had further certification in advanced pediatric cardiology. He was later awarded the Fellowship of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health of the United Kingdom in 2012. Professor Samuel Ilenre Omokhodion started his academic career in the Department of Pediatrics of this university as Lecturer 1 on 1st of June 1987. Was promoted to Senior Lecturer effective 1st of October 1992, Reader 1st October 2003, and Professor 1st October 2006. He has to his credit 76 academic publications in both local and international outlets, including books, chapters in books, and journal articles. He has mentored and supervised research projects in 26 postgraduate residents, all of whom have successfully defended their dissertations for the award of the fellowship of either the West African College of Physicians or the National Postgraduate Medical College of Nigeria. 2 of them are now professors, 1 of them a reader, and all the others are holding their own in their various endeavors across the country and abroad. Within this university, Professor Omokhodion has served in many capacities, including acting head, Department of Pediatrics, between 1998 and 2000, head of department 2011 to 2015, chairman of the planning committee for the acquisition and utilization of the Otumba Tunwase National Pediatric Hospital, Ijebu-Ode, constituted by the Academic Board of the College of Medicine, chairman of the Distinguished Alumni Award Committee of the Academic Board of the College of Medicine, member, Faculty of Clinical Sciences Committee on the NUC proposal on possession of PhD by medically qualified lecturers as a prerequisite for various academic roles, member of the College of Committee on the same issue, and also member of the board of postgraduate committee. Outside the university, Professor Omokhodion is a member of many associations and societies, including the Nigerian Medical Association, Pediatric Association of Nigeria, Nigerian Cardiac Society, where he served as Secretary General from 2002 to 2006, and Pan-African Society of Cardiology, PASCA, where he also served as Secretary General between 2006 and 2014, and currently member of the Governing Council, Chairman of the Pan-African Network of Pediatric Cardiologists, the Task Force on Pediatric Cardiology of PASCA between 2009 and 2015, member of the European Society of Cardiology, as well as the European Society on Heart Failure. He serves regularly as a resource person at the Faculty of Pediatrics annual update courses of the National Postgraduate Medical College of Nigeria and the West African College of Physicians, as well as a member of their course of examiners. He has served as external examiner to several universities, including University of Benin, Olabisi Onabanjo University, Ogun State, University of Maiduguri, Obafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife, Manda Fodio University in Sokoto, Ladoke Akintola University of Technology in Ogbomoso, where Osogbo campus. He has served as a member and in other instances as chairman of West African College of Physicians and the NPGMC and Nigerian Postgraduate Medical College of Nigeria accreditation teams to some teaching hospitals across the country, and chairman of the Curriculum Development Committee for Subspecialty Training in Pediatric Cardiology, among several others. Professor Samuel Omokhodion has forged international collaboration with centers in Israel, Ghana, India, and Italy, establishing in 1998 the Save a Child's Heart Foundation, Nigeria, the first not-for-profit non-governmental organization in the country devoted solely to the amelioration of the plight of children with structural heart diseases. The scope was later expanded to include capacity building in manpower and infrastructural development. On that platform, 436 Nigerian children from 32 states of the Federation have had life-saving heart surgical treatment in partner sites. It was instrumental to the signing of an MOU lately between the University of Ibadan, College of Medicine, University College Hospital Ibadan, Federal Ministry of Health, and Barbini Cardiopatici nel Mondo and Policiclino San Donatus, both of Milan, Italy. Both of Milan, Italy, under which a 100-bed center for cardiovascular diseases for UCH and a research and training institute also of cardiovascular disease for UI are to be built at the UCH. The implementation of this agreement is ongoing. Professor Samuel Omokhodion serves as the current senior pastor of Christ Chapel, University College Hospital, the chaplain to the University College Hospital, and chairman of the chaplaincy committee of the hospital. He is happily married to Professor Folashade Olufunke Omokhodion, and the marriage is blessed with children. I now call on Professor Omokhodion to deliver his lecture titled Of Auricles and Ventricles, the Squeeze, the Ease, and Hues Surmounting the Odds.
The Vice Chancellor, sir, ably represented by the Deputy Vice Chancellor Administration, Professor Ayelari, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research, Innovation and Strategic Partnerships, Registrar, Librarian, Provost of the College of Medicine, also represented, Dean of the Faculty of Clinical Sciences, Dean of the Postgraduate School, Deans of other faculties and students. And I want to add my distinguished elder colleagues in the profession, ladies and gentlemen. With immense gratitude to the Almighty God, I stand before you this evening to deliver the 413th inaugural lecture of my great alma mater, the 14th in the 2016-2017 series. 4 others from my department have done this before, and they are Professor J.B. Familusi, who in 1981 spoke on children, viruses, problems and promises. Professor Olufemi Jaisimi, who in 1986 spoke on cruelty to children by nature and man. Professor Olugbenro Shodende, who spoke on students and teachers, a celebration in 1999, and Professor Kikelomo Shinusi, who spoke on Choose Your Mother Right and Leave in 2010. Permit me, Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, to begin this lecture with some reminiscences necessary to clarify my message on mentoring. Following my matriculation as a prelim student in October 1971, it seemed like a far-flung possibility that I would one day graduate as a doctor. I had wrestled with the choice of either pursuing a career in engineering or medicine. I had taken and passed the concessionary entrance examinations for both to 4 of the universities. My parents were, however, quite resolved, along with my chemistry teachers, Mr. Edokpolo and Mr. Griffiths, who gave me a ride to Ibadan to take the concessional entrance examination to the University of Ibadan. And they were all unanimous: go for medicine. Thus began my pursuit of a career in medicine. When 6 years down the road, I was called upon, along with 105 others, to take the Hippocratic Oath at my induction into the medical profession on the 29th of June, 1977. It was a dream realized. 40 years later, I am grateful to God that I heeded their advice. The following, therefore, Mr. Vice Chancellor, is an account of my odyssey so far in research, teaching, and service to the community as a doctor, pediatrician, pediatric cardiologist, and a university academic. I'd like to state that it wasn't all a rosy path. I recall as a junior resident, it was my turn to make a presentation at the weekly postgraduate round. Professor Antia was presiding. I did what I thought was my best then, but he effortlessly saw through the holes in my presentation and tore it to shreds. He had a look at the patient who had been admitted that day and whom he was yet to see. He was so confident that the child had transposition of the great arteries. He was right. He was like a magician, so I thought. After being thoroughly deflated, I determined that day not only to be reflated, but also to take up the discipline of cardiology and excel in it. That resolve was very much strengthened by retired Professor Jaisimi, together with now retired Professor Tom Luskut of the University of Amsterdam. They were very instrumental in guiding my debut in the research arena. The work that I undertook then on cardiovascular complications of perinatal asphyxia for my dissertation became a notable study, which also defined my interest in heart failure and biomarkers of heart failure in children. These will be given considerable attention further in the course of this lecture. I owe them and a host of others a debt of gratitude for the collective mentorship I enjoyed in having them as my teachers. There is a lot to be said for that phase of collective mentoring in the life of a young career-seeking medical academic. The wisdom in the adage found in many of our cultures in Nigeria, which says, it takes a set of parents to bring a child into the world, but it takes a village to raise the child for the world, is evident. I attest to the very positive roles that collective mentorship has played in shaping my career. It is a cardinal necessity to being a good clinician, a good researcher, and then a good academic. It gives one a far more rounded and enduring foundation. I was able to make a well-informed choice without recriminations from any quarters. I will always appreciate that. It is gratifying to note that the university has over the last few years embarked on promoting the culture of mentorship, which was rapidly receding into oblivion. Much of the indiscipline and loss of etiquette of civil conduct can be traced back to the lack of proper mentoring. I was a house officer when I consulted now Emeritus Professor Nodeko in the medical outpatient one afternoon for some symptoms I was experiencing. I bet he won't remember. He had medical students in the room with him, all of whom he promptly asked to leave the room until he had completed what was a thorough evaluation of my complaints with a prescription at the end of the consultation. I felt so honored by a very senior colleague and teacher. I took very much to his prescription and had relief of my symptoms in no time. 35 years later, a senior female consultant colleague was lamenting to my hearing that she had visited a younger consultant in his consulting room in the same hospital for medical consultation. He similarly had medical students in the room. Our expectations of privacy was not only dashed as the students stayed on, but at the point when the younger consultant was then inviting the students to view and examine her, she protested and left the room. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, permit me to use this platform to make a passionate plea for you to use all at your disposal during your tenure to significantly strengthen the culture of mentoring at the University of Ibadan. And let me borrow from the words of the scriptures found in Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 20 in the NIV version. He who walks with the wise grows wise, but the companion of fools suffers harm. And I quote from a nationalist, if by dint of fortune I seem to see further, it is because I stand on the shoulders of those who have been before me, unquote. Nelson Mandela. Next slide, please. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, I would now come to the title of my lecture. The two upper chambers of the heart were once called auricles, but they are now restricted in usage to the atrial appendage, while the two lower chambers have retained the names ventricles. The contraction of the heart is what I refer to as the squeeze, and the relaxation as the ease. The various shades of bluish discoloration that appears on the lips, mucous membranes, palms, and the skin of light complexion children when deoxygenated blood is recirculated through the body is what I refer to as the hues. I have chosen the title of my lecture, therefore, to reflect on the many odds that are pitted against the heart from the time it is being formed, against its function, against the child in his fight to live and achieve his maximum potential in life, and my modest contributions in surmounting those odds. Therefore, I invite you to an account of auricles and ventricles, the squeeze, the ease, and the hues, surmounting the odds. Next slide, please. Now, I had made my debut in research arena on returning from my subspecialty training at the University of Amsterdam, and I had the opportunity of seeing and participating in the use of cutting-edge technology in the care of all grades of patients. I was working at our special care baby unit on my return, where the facilities available was a far cry from what I had become used to at the academic medical center. We were seeing many babies who had suffered perinatal stress, starting extrauterine life, having been severely asphyxiated. This was an uncommon situation at the AMC because labor is very closely monitored and appropriate intervention is readily instituted before the degree of perinatal stress often seen here sets in. Let me now describe a very common scenario. When these babies are asphyxiated, that is, they do not cry promptly on delivery, everyone gets worried because the very vitally needed capacity to establish his own independent ventilation now having been extracted from the womb is in jeopardy. And when that happens on a severe scale, multiple organ damage can ensue. And it is caused by a deprivation of oxygen and sometimes a deprivation of adequate blood flow to those organs. And those organs, the brain and the heart inclusive, can suffer severe injury. This can significantly worsen the prognosis for the newborn baby. He becomes very ill from the onset, from multi-organ dysfunction. How do you tell the contribution of cardiac failure in such a baby facing such odds? Because there are many organs that are dysfunctional. And workers in the neonatal intensive care and the special care baby unit are often at pains to decide which organ has failed and which one is intact. Now, the next slide. Relying on clinical assessment is often unrewarding because many of the clinical signs are non-specific to cardiac failure. On the other hand, at the time I am speaking about, many point of care, invasive and non-invasive monitors were lacking. And with these newborn babies, the window of error is extremely narrow. The newborn, especially when they are preterm. It was obvious, specific and sensitive biomarkers of myocardial injury were needed. And this was what informed my embarking on my first active research, in which I enrolled 23 Nigerian babies who had suffered severe asphyxiation, asphyxiation of varying degrees, and 12 apparently healthy controls who had not been asphyxiated. They were evaluated at birth and managed according to standard protocol, and they were assigned to one of 4 groups according to internationally accepted criteria. And these were transient tachypnea of the newborn, persistent fetal circulation, transient tricuspid incompetence, and cardiogenic shock. And from each baby, I obtained 1 ml of cord blood at birth, and at 6 to 8 hours of life, another ml of blood, and then between 24 and 36 hours, another ml, and then between 72 and 100 hours, the final blood sample. Now, in order to understand this result, which is summarized in the figures displayed, you need to understand the argument that was raging then, which prevented people from being inclined to the use of these biomarkers in the newborn. Creatine kinase, it was argued, is present in skeletal muscles. So even if you assayed blood and you found elevated creatine kinase, there was no grounds on which you could argue that it was coming from the heart as a marker of hypoxemic injury to the heart. However, the isoenzyme, the MB fraction, is more specific to the myocardium. And what we needed was, when these samples, unfortunately, it was not possible to process them here. I had to spin them, extract the serum, store them at minus 70 degrees at special freezers that were then available at IMRAT, and then took them with me to Amsterdam, where it was permitted to do that. They were then assayed and analyzed for creatine kinase activity at 30 degrees centigrade and the isoenzyme fraction MB at 30 degrees centigrade. Ladies and gentlemen, if you take a look at the diagrams displayed on the screens, you will see that the creatine kinase made a peak value at 6 to 8 hours. Now, that could not have been helpful, as I said earlier. But what was important was that at 6 to 8 hours, the MB isoenzyme fraction also made a peak, corresponding to the same time that the creatine kinase made a peak. This was very significant. So not only was creatine kinase being released perhaps from skeletal muscles and maybe the myocardium, but now we had something that the myocardial band was certainly coming from the heart, indicating that injury had occurred. And this had happened in the asphyxiated infants, but not in the controls, as you see the flat curve of the controls in both cases. This was a landmark study, and it was published in the European Heart Journal, and it was among the 10 invited presentations at the main plenary sessions of the second International Symposium on Heart Failure, Mechanisms and Management that was held then in Geneva, Switzerland May 16 to 20, 1993. Sequel to these, other reports followed, and soon the assay of CK and CKMB soon became part of the workup for identifying myocardial injury at neonatal intensive care units. I also had the opportunity, just in case this was a fluke, to compare a biracial set of newborns who had suffered perinatal stress. The initial group that I earlier referred to, and another group of Dutch asphyxiated newborns, 14 of them, and 16 healthy controls. For brevity, I will avoid the description of the various procedures that were entailed in this. All the infants had standard 12-lead ECG at between 6 to 12 hours postnatal life, and followed by 24-hour Holter ECG recording after the standard ECG. Cord blood, pH, glucose, and bicarbonate were measured for all the babies, and thereafter the rhythm, rate, conduction disorders were sought using the then commercially available Oxford Medilog ECG analyzer. And standards were compared with the Davignon et al. Reference values, because this was the universally accepted reference values at the time. The rhythm, rate, P-wave, PR intervals, and QRS duration were normal in the study subjects and their respective controls on standard ECG. But when we took a look at the prolonged recordings, that's the Holter 24-hour ECG recording, this allowed a better assessment of what was really happening to these infants. The prevalence of ST segment depression in the bicordial lead, V4 in particular, was significantly higher in the asphyxiated Nigerian infants than in the controls. Similarly, its prevalence in the Dutch asphyxiated infants was significantly different from the zero prevalence amongst the Dutch controls. The long duration ECG recording also unveiled the fixed heart phenomenon in the asphyxiated infants of both races. The conclusion we drew was that ST segment depression may imply myocardial ischemia in the asphyxiated Dutch newborns, but such may not be inferred in the asphyxiated Nigerian newborns. However, fixed heart rate phenomenon, which in essence means the heart had been stunned by severe asphyxiation and therefore it had lost its capacity for sinus arrhythmia, was observed in both racial groups. Again, this was a notable study and continues to be cited as a reference work. And I wish now to draw attention to we're talking about the odds against newborn babies. What about when the odds come in the guise of innocence? There are many things that come not in their true colors, but sometimes in fashions that hide their true identity. Such is the case for a mama, often heard in a newborn in the first few days of life, and often they were tagged innocent mamas when the babies looked well and they were asymptomatic. So to all intents and purposes, the mama would pass as an innocent mama. It was traditional belief that the left to right shunting lesions, such as a VSD, could not produce a mama that early in life, because it was thought that the pressures on the right side were higher than on the left and would not allow a shunt capable of generating a mama. As a result, many congenital defects passed undetected during the early phase of life. This is a terrible odd, especially because we see many congenital defects presenting quite late in our practice when complications may have set in. It was necessary to catch this odd whenever it was present. So we decided to test the value of a murmur heard in the first few days of life in babies that were otherwise well. At the Hadassah Hebrew University Hospital in Jerusalem, we retrieved the records of 20,323 live births recorded over a 3-year period, seeking for babies who were referred for echocardiography solely on account of a murmur. They were asymptomatic. 170 such babies were found. And listen to this, 147 of them were found to have structural heart disease. And the most common lesions found are shown in the table below: ventricular septal defect, patent ductus arteriosus, a combination of both, and valvar pulmonary stenosis. Now, the next slide will also show that we had the next one, and we'll come back to this. The next slide. 3 of those babies also had aortic valvar stenosis, and 7 of them had unsuspected complex heart diseases. Only 13% of the newborns referred for evaluation of a murmur had no identifiable structural heart disease. The audible threshold of a murmur corresponded to a maximum instantaneous gradient of 25 millimeters of mercury. And that was what the previous slide was attempting to show, but because of the technical nature, let's skip it. Now, the conclusion was that most asymptomatic newborns with a murmur in the first few days of life have a structural heart defect. The implications for practice, therefore, is that a diagnosis of innocent murmur must be a diagnosis of exclusion. We must never apply this appellation to a murmur, even if the baby looks very well. Now, what about when the odds are pitted from birth? A broad spectrum of heart diseases occur as a result of malformations of the heart during development and are therefore present at birth, called congenital heart diseases. Congenital heart diseases account for nearly 1/3 of all major congenital anomalies. The incidence of congenital heart disease ranges from about 7 to 12 per 1,000 live births. That translates to 1.35 million babies born with congenital heart diseases every year worldwide. And when you apply that to the African continent, with an estimated population of 450 million, 250,000 babies are born on the continent every year with congenital heart defects. And in Nigeria, with an estimated population of 180 million, that translates to 74,000 babies born every year in Nigeria with congenital heart defects. Among all the congenital anomalies, congenital heart diseases have the greatest adverse impact on infants and childhood mortality. The burden of congenital heart disease is often overshadowed by the incidence of communicable diseases. In developing countries like Nigeria, children with congenital heart defects have little or no access to treatment of any form. Congenital heart diseases are usually categorized into 2 broad groups depending on the presence of cyanosis, which means a bluish discoloration in varying hues. The acyanotic group, which means the group without cyanosis, usually derived from lesions that allow left to right shunting, in which oxygenated blood is recirculated through the lungs. And the cyanotic group are the ones with this bluish hue. And unfortunately, this is often mistaken as a dark complexion individual when they come. And it is because the deoxygenated blood that needs oxygen replenishing bypasses the lungs where it should pick up oxygen, and it then recirculated through the body. This is a major odd against the child. And let me show you how some of these defects arise in these animated views. As you can see between the two upper chambers in the views being shown, that the partitioning wall, which is supposed to be complete, is incomplete, and it allows gaps, and they are referred to in lay terminology as holes in the heart. And the second animated view, it is between the two lower chambers. Similarly, the partitioning wall allows gaps. There is incomplete partitioning. And these latter group are the ones that particularly present a problem to the newborn child. Next slide, please. Two-dimensional echocardiography, which uses echo, ultrasound, allows accurate anatomic diagnosis, while color-coded Doppler interrogation allows hemodynamic and quantitative measurements. These permit measurements of functional parameters as well. Objective assessment of the patient's status is achieved and can be repeated as often as necessary, since ultrasound, the image-generating medium, is harmless to the body tissue. In this picture, as you see, there is a gap between the two upper chambers, and you can see the blood coded with hues of red and yellow here, flowing through from the left side to the right side. That should not be so. Next slide, please. The other group, the category, these are the ones that have cyanosis. The two usual examples are tetralogy of Fallot and transposition of the great arteries. And we'll focus on transposition of the great arteries because that was the one where we had a bit of some work by our team. Transposition of the great arteries is a major odd. Here, I have tagged these wrong connections because the aorta, which is normally the outflow tract that normally arises from the left side of the heart, is now arising from the right side. Whereas the pulmonary artery, which normally arises from the right side of the heart, is now arising from the left side. Now, ordinarily, these are parallel circulations and will be incompatible with life unless there was a gap created, a hole in the heart between the two sides, as shown in the second image. If that hole was not there, and no hole was there between the upper chambers, and if the attending physician had a sufficiently high index of suspicion, he will easily recognize this anomaly. And in developed centers, it is possible to rapidly create an artificial hole between the two upper chambers, saving the life of the baby. This is known as Rashkin's balloon atrial septostomy. Never mind that name, it's just a way of doctors getting. Now, next slide, please. Surgical option for such babies wasn't even available, Mr. Vice Chancellor. And I'll tell you why. The surgical option is a prolonged operative process. And sometimes when the switch operation is to be performed, they can run in some complex situations where they require grafting of the coronary arteries in addition for as long as 36 hours and over 40 hours. Certainly, no one team could remain on their feet standing for that long. And in advanced centers, it requires at least 2 teams to share their work for that day. And when one work, because there are standard operation procedures for this, When one team has carried the process to a certain level, the next team comes in and completes the process. We don't even have a complete team here in Nigeria. Talk less of having two. So how can we possibly engage in the repair of such complex malformations? Just to give you an insight, for one simple pump-supported case, you need 2 cardiac surgeons, 2 cardiac anesthetists, 2 perfusionists, 2 operating room nurses, a pediatric cardiologist standing by, technical support, and so on and so forth, just for one simple repair of an ASD or a VSD. When it comes to transposition of the great arteries, it's an even more involved process. The delicate post-operative transition from pump support to non-pump support is very tricky and requires delicate balancing because you need to understand the hemodynamics of a newborn baby. And you require, in a high dependency unit, such as the intensive care where such babies are transferred to from the operating room, 1 nurse to 1 patient in an 8-hour shift. Very often we don't even have 1 nurse. Well, I leave you to estimate. A lot of consumables are utilized. They have prolonged hospital stay thereafter. The human and capital intensive implications are obvious. The majority of patients, families in Nigeria cannot afford the cost involved in such procedures. Many of them end up dying needlessly. And that was why the team involving Dr. Brimo, Professor Adegboye, Professor Adebo, and our pediatric cardiology unit embarked on the utilization of a palliative process. Normally, this palliative process I described earlier on as Rashkin's procedure must be done within hours delivery. But many of our babies don't have that chance, so they survive in spite of all the odds, and then they present late. And when they come, here is what we did. 14 consecutive patients with transposition of great arteries were palliated by the team I referred to earlier on. They were aged between 3 and 11 months. And they comprised 8 males and 6 females. 6 patients had Blalock-Hanlon atrial septectomy with 2 deaths within 48 hours. 4 patients had Blalock toxic shunt with no mortality. 4 had pulmonary artery banding with 2 deaths within 72 hours. The overall operative mortality was 28.6%. All 10 survivors had improvement in their clinical features with a decrease in PCV during up to 13 months of follow-up. We thus demonstrated that appropriate and timely palliative surgery has a place in surmounting some of the odds in the management transposition of the great arteries where access to definitive correction is not available. There are the host of acquired heart diseases. For brevity and time, I would like to skip this, but to draw attention to the fact that this remains a heavy disease burden on the African continent. The only point to make here is that in the southwest of Nigeria, we appear to be recording a steady decline in the incidence of this. We looked at the records of UCH over a 30-year period and we witnessed a steady decline. And we then went on the field, had people assess school children, looking for evidence of mitral valve regurgitation, that is leaking mitral valve, and they found very few of them. And when a school search was further carried out, looking at the throat swabs of these school children, we didn't find the usual culprit, which was group A beta hemolytic streptococcal strain. And this was carried out by Dr. Sado in Benin City and recently replicated in Abeokuta. And we were forced to ask, Are we witnessing some form of epidemiologic transition here? That much I will say. Next slide please. There were other acquired heart diseases to which significant contributions were made, and these included constrictive pericarditis. This remains important because it is caused by tuberculosis to a large extent in many of our patients. That is recorded in the tables. Next slide, please. Infective endocarditis was another very interesting case. We encountered a baby who developed a fever at 28 hours of age. Although she had a negative sepsis workup, she was treated with various antibiotics to no avail. She developed features in keeping with overwhelming sepsis, and a murmur developed by the 30th day of life. She needed to have an echocardiogram, which was not available at the time. We were then forced to take the baby to the private facility of Dr. Tony Mariu. He made no charges. But alas, this was done on the 30th day of life. Perhaps if we had the facility to have done it earlier, the story might have been different. Having identified a vegetation attached to the ventricular surface of the tricuspid valve, we were contemplating a surgical intervention, but the baby didn't stay that long. We lost the child. However, at autopsy, the vegetation was confirmed, but something very unusual. It was due to Candida. This was not an organism that we were used to seeing at that point. There was the argument as to whether the intensive antibiotic therapy allowed this opportunistic infection to have caused that. But it's never known. However, the fact is that we saw this vegetation in what was then in published English literature, the youngest baby who had been reported as having Candida endocarditis. And we described the various features, and that compelled us to go back to the autopsy records of the hospital for over a 30-year period. And we found 120 cases of infective endocarditis, out of which 19 were in children. And we described the various features. Now, next slide. These were the slides. The first reveals the, unfortunately I don't have my pointer here. The first was the vegetation shown at the autopsy sample. The arrow is pointing to it. And the next slide, the conditions that later on. Now, any of the conditions I have described can result in heart failure. The only thing that I have time to say here is that having described the various conditions that can lead to heart failure, again, in a challenged setting, such as what we have here, where you do not have ready access to point-of-care instrumentation, how do you identify this? And this was what led us to define clinically elicitable signs by which you can easily recognize heart failure at the bedside of a baby. And we designed a score chart. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And this is the chart, and it is called Ibadan Childhood Heart Failure Severity Score. And I'm happy to say that this has now gone through a validation test and assessment, and I am happy that that initial is very promising. Next slide, please. We have gone further to establish reference values for electrocardiography, and to date, to the best of our knowledge, we have the largest series of 1,500 children in whom we have done the most comprehensive ECG study values. And these have found major differences from what was traditionally our only recourse, the Davignon reference values. Next slide, please. We've done the same for echocardiography and have extended these to children with sickle cell diseases. Next slide, please. Now, I come to my final point. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, what do you do when faced with the sort of odds I have tried very hard to describe in the last 40 minutes? Let me explain, sir. Level A, cardiovascular healthcare facility, provides diagnostic services only. Level B provides diagnostic services with partial solutions, usually palliative in nature. And level C provides all diagnostic services with the provision of the full range of definitive interventional and surgical solutions. Ibadan has hovered over the years between level B and has made several attempts to cross over to having level C without success. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, I started having my hopes fading when I realized that people who were much greater in stature have tried in their days to make government provide these level C facilities here in Ibadan. And when you have those facilities, it is said that it transforms the status of your health facility into a 5-star facility. And yet, we haven't quite succeeded. I then thought it was necessary to try other strategies. And let me, in the time that I have left, quickly describe 2 episodes. I have resorted to inviting every team I have met to assist with capacity building here in Ibadan, not because I don't feel the shame of saying that we don't have those facilities here, but what else would you do? Capitulate and leave and check out? But no. Well, amongst the many that I have had the opportunity, and fortuitously, I found so much goodwill. One of those was in Israel. I met Dr. Amram Cohen, who was a cardiac surgeon practicing in one of 15 centers who were offering level C cardiovascular healthcare facility to a population of Israel then of less than 6 million. Here we were, 180 million, and we don't even have one functioning center that has a steady, regular service. I then decided, I went to him and engaged in advocacy and said, would you include our patients? Because I got to hear that he was going to the Palestinian control areas looking for patients to operate on. There was an obvious underutilization of your capacity. I then went and said, can you include our patients? We have lots of them. They have nowhere to go. And he turned and he looked at me. We only met at a conference. And he said, if you can get them here, we'll fix them. And I looked at him and I thought it looked and sounded too good to be true. But he was later to be proved right and honest. Because the first 3 patients left on 19th of November, 1998. And they went and came back and they were successfully totally corrected. And when they arrived, I recall the case of the 9-year-old boy who had often been carried on her mother's back to every clinic appointment. When they arrived at the airport and the mother was looking around to see the same type of boy, the mothers had been unable to go with them. And the boy was amazed and said, Iyami, Emire. And at that point, the mother wondered, was it really you? And he saw the child, and the child ran into her arms. And of course, I don't need to tell you how emotional that scene was. Now, I will have to skip the others because I have run out of time. But, ladies and gentlemen, what I am saying here is that I have recently had the opportunity of engaging in the attraction of 6 interest groups who have come together and say, let us together see how we can tackle this problem of a lack of facilities in our area. And I'm happy to announce here on the platform, Mr. Vice Chancellor, you were a part of that process. The University of Ibadan, the College of Medicine, the University College Hospital, and the Federal Minister of Health, the present Minister of Health, got to hear of this program and bought into it and invited us and has insisted that as part of a counterpart funding, his ministry will take responsibility for the clinical aspect. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have done, we set up a counterpart group, NGO. 1,756 children came to us while we operated, seeking help, asking to leave. We found funds for only 436 of them who were able to go and have surgery and return safely. Many of them have developed. Some of them have now graduated from the university and are being occupying their places in society. It may be a drop in the ocean, but we have done our bit. And I'd like to end this by saying, ladies and gentlemen, at a time when it was, in conclusion, that is I'm making now, at a time when it was difficult to ascertain the precise role of a compromised heart in the illness that follows perinatal stress in a newborn, I, among others, undertook a search for and helped in the identification of serum creatine kinase and its enzyme CKMB as a sensitive and specific marker of myocardial injury in perinatally asphyxiated newborns. Other newer biomarkers have since emerged, troponin and BMP. 2, when controversy surrounded the significance of a murmur heard in the first few days of life in an otherwise healthy newborn, I was an active part of the effort that resolved the controversy. A murmur must never be classified innocent until possible causes have been excluded, even in the first few days of life. 3, when sophisticated ancillary tools are lacking and the diagnosis of the failing squeeze or ease of the heart becomes a problem in a child, I have demonstrated the usefulness of clinically elicitable science in grading system that enables not only a diagnosis to be made of heart failure, but its grading as well. And when recourse to surgical or catheter intervention solutions are hard to come by, our team showed the usefulness of appropriate time palliation in the management of such patients. Number 5, we have provided key clinical science and evidence that helps the easier recognition of constrictive pericarditis, infective endocarditis, and neonatal candida endocarditis. Number 6, we have also provided ECG and echo reference values. And lastly, we have offered vital international bridges, providing life-saving definitive solutions for some which have led to capacity building opportunities, potentially able to provide us with the much needed level C cardiovascular healthcare status. Ibadan and many other centers in Nigeria must attain this 5-star status. My recommendations are few, Mr. Vice Chancellor. The university, already a signatory to the MOU that provides for this endeavor, should give priority attention to the Institution of Cardiovascular Diseases, which, if completed soon and handed over to the university, will be the first of its kind in Africa. The only other centers that have such leanings on the continent of Africa are those in Alexandria, Egypt, and Cape Town in South Africa. But they are integral parts of their existing cardiovascular departments. The Institute of Cardiovascular Diseases will be the first stand-alone university-based research and training center if it is completed. And lastly, Mr. Vice Chancellor, I plead for the strengthening of the already existing university organs to source funds for continuing capital development and sustenance of university-approved programs. And let me now go to acknowledgements. I do not have much time left, but let me begin by thanking the Almighty God who has superintended over my life and enabled me with the grace to be able to make the modest mark that I have been able to. Psalm 124 says, if it had not been for the Lord, we would have been swallowed up. Next, I thank my parents, here shown, who made enormous sacrifices to ensure that my siblings and I had the education that they couldn't have. I will always appreciate them. They are both gone on to glory now. And then, let me skip this and go on to the next slide. I will come to the last one quickly. I wish to greatly and deeply appreciate my wife of 37 years, Professor Folashade Olufunke Omokhodion. Now, how do I describe a mother in Israel? How do I describe someone who has simply been a blessing to have in your life? I can only say, I thank God that I married her. Next slide, please. And we have been blessed by 3 lovely children. And by the grace of God, they are developed. And they are holding their own in their various fields. And well, too. Next slide, please. And I wish to pay special tribute to my teachers in pediatrics, those who helped shape my career and to whom I looked up to. There's no time to list all of them, but they are there listed. And even those teachers who were not in my department, and they are here listed, I thank all of you. I owe you all a debt of gratitude, and I thank you. Those are the shoulders that I referred to when I quoted Nelson Mandela. Next slide, please. The Christ Chapel family. Oh, this was a major support. I can't possibly list every member here, but it was like another family. And for the last 26 years in which I have had the opportunity of providing spiritual leadership there, it has been home away from home. Thank you to all of you. And I want to especially here speak of the Save a Child's Heart Foundation and the very first chairman of the Board of Trustees, Emeritus Professor O.O. Akinkugbe. He provided guidance at the time we needed it, and his presence was of immense value to the organization. The Israeli embassy actually took to the organization and appointed a representative on the Board of Trustees, Mr. Uri Curtis. And I thank all the others who have been part of this obvious success story. The present Department of Pediatrics, in particular the present head of department, Professor Ike Oluwa Lagunju. This team, I will let you into a quick secret. I would have gone elsewhere, but I thank God I didn't, and I stayed back. This is a real family. Thank you very much. And the UCH cardiac team, all of you are listed. Thank you very much. And then lastly, but not the least, next slide, please. Thank you all for your kind attention. And I thank you for giving me this opportunity for reporting on what has been my odyssey in the last couple of years. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chancellor.